Hello, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Professor, where we answer your questions on current events, economics, political philosophy, and our life together in society.
Here's a question that comes from Laurel, and she asks, I have frequently thought that many things considered rights are in fact needs. And the moment people demand their rights, something has gone wrong. It's the idea of obligations that resolves the issue. We have the human obligation to meet human needs, and rights only exist in practicality if they are acknowledged by others. But then she asks, what then about Locke's right to life, liberty, and property? Are they innate, whether or not they are acknowledged?
Yes, is the short answer. Obviously, I'm not going to get away with just saying that, but they are innate. And the problem of political philosophy, which is often underestimated, is first to figure out what innate rights are and then to figure out how do we go about acknowledging them. Because it's one thing to have a right inherently from God if you believe he's the author of natural law or simply coming from this natural law that exists in a free-floating state. It's another thing to say, how does a political community create law that reflects what the law ought to be? And there's a school that just tosses the whole thing over the side and says anything that we say is law is law. But obviously this leads to any kind of barbarism or atrocity you could imagine. The Holocaust, for instance, you write a law saying it's okay to kill Jews. In fact, the state must kill Jews. You kill Jews. Okay, that's lawful on paper, but obviously that is profoundly unlawful. And that means there must be a higher law to which human law must aspire. And in some places, they simply deny that this is an issue. Saudi Arabia, for example, they just say the Quran is our constitution. And say, how do we interpret it? How do we work this out in detail? There is no problem of interpretation. And if you say there is, well, they throw you in jail, cut your head off, and sort of Stalin's no man, no problem theory. But we don't do it that way. We need to figure out, first of all, what our inherent rights are, and then we have to work out how, as a community, when it comes to creating law, do we ensure that we discuss the fundamental morality of the law and then try to put down in a human law code this higher law and continually measure what we've done against this standard. It's not an easy business, but it's an essential business. And then we get to the question of whether rights consist of those things only that you can have without taking them from someone else. For instance, my right to life doesn't involve my taking your life. I mean, if you attack me, I'm allowed to defend myself, but fundamentally, there's enough life to go around. But if we say, well, you have a right to food, and there's one piece of food, two people come along, there's a real issue there. Now, Locke, his life, liberty, and property, obviously my liberty to act, as long as I don't commit force or fraud against you, doesn't infringe your liberty to act, as long as you don't use force or fraud on me. As for property, what Locke meant was whatever we had done with our time and effort was rightfully ours, provided, again, that we hadn't stolen it to begin with or something like that. So these are these non-competing rights. But the other kind result in a free-for-all because you don't have an inherent right to somebody else's lunch if they earned it with the sweat of their brow. They may have a moral obligation to be compassionate to you, but that doesn't mean you can go to a policeman and say, I want his sandwich and I want it now. And that's really important when we start to talk about, for instance, the right to free speech versus the right not to be offended. Because there's no right not to be offended. That one isn't one that anybody can have. Free speech is fine. Anybody can say what they think, but they don't have a right to walk up to you, grab you by the lapel, and shout it at you when you don't want to hear it. There's no right to an audience. This is simply a distinction between those real rights that inhere in us because we own ourselves. Locke thought kind of on lease from God. Other people say absolutely. But all those things that simply pertain to us, we have a right to. It's other people's stuff we don't have a right to. And when we write the law wrong, what we do is we start giving one another not rights but wrongs. The ability to take from someone else what is rightfully theirs. And that's what we must avoid doing.
Like, for instance, in Ontario, they want to give free tuition, university tuition, to certain students where there's a means test right there. So people who can't afford it can get to university without paying tuition. Well, that means somebody will be forced to pay it for them. That's what you're talking about, right? This is the wrong kind of rights.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one thing to say that everybody has a right to an education in the sense that every child must be given basics of literacy and numerical skills and awareness of the world. And we do think that's true. These are not adults ready to go, elbows up into the world of contract, and parents who don't give their kids the ability to read some fundamental knowledge are rightly considered abusive. But when it comes to university tuition, you're talking about bright, upwardly mobile people who are taking money from others, many of whom haven't had a university education, in order that they will go on in life to earn more money, have higher social status, and get to go around despising the mechanics and the cleaners whose taxes paid for them to hang around studying Sociology 101 and get exactly the wrong idea of rights. So rights are self-ownership and the right to make our own decisions and to do our best in life, including looking out for the less fortunate as we see fit. Rights are not the right to reach out your claw and thrust it into someone else's pocket and take their money, to demand their attention, to insist that they respect you. Respect is earned. It is not taken by the state and redistributed according to notions of social justice. So yes, rights must come from a higher law, or we have no standard against which to judge specific existing man-made law. It's a tricky process, but it's an essential one and worthy of our attention.
All right, let me ask you a political question then, because the wrong kind of right, that's a thing you find a lot in left-leaning political parties like the Liberals in Ontario. Why is it that right-wing parties or so-called conservative parties in this country don't talk the way you just did?
There are all kinds of reasons, some more credible, some less credible. And I want to pick one of the more credible reasons because I think, A, we want to be generous, B, we want to be practical. This older notion of rights tended to be strong, to some extent dominant, if not all, sometimes dormant, but it really did underlie what people were talking about, I think, until the 1960s. And what happened in the 1960s was this sudden, I mean, it's ridiculous that it would be sudden, but it was sudden, discovery of racial injustice. That all this fancy talk about rights and freedom and self-ownership and democracy and anybody can make it simply excluded large numbers of people because of the color of their skin. And people said something must be done. We must force people not to be bigots. And this gave them the idea that fundamental decency was not something that arose from the free and spontaneous interaction of people left to their own devices, but was beaten out of them by the state through civil rights acts and affirmative action programs. And this became the model for decent interaction generally, that nobody was going to be nice to anybody except people who looked exactly like them if the state didn't grab a hold of them and threaten them and twist their arm. Now, in the long run, this is doomed, but in the short run, we have to understand it gave a powerful impetus to the notion that coercion rather than cooperation was the basis of decency. And we have to admit that this happened. We can't just say it wasn't there, or let's not talk about that, it's awkward. We have to confront it directly and say what was wrong with segregation, racial slavery, and all these things was that they denied liberty and self-ownership to a large number of people, including through law. And that the mistake was not to have the principles of liberty, but it was to fail to apply them widely enough. And if we talk like that, we can get back to this, what I think most people understand instinctively, including these millennials. Everyone's talking about the millennials. What do the millennials think? Well, they like to be in charge of their own destiny. That's what John Locke wanted. That's what we want. That's what they want. We just have to present it without being obtuse or surly.
All right, then we'll get right on to this. All right, thanks, folks. If you want to play along, look on the screen, the URL. Well, you will find the information about how to ask your question is displayed. Thanks, and see you next time.